Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, June 20th, 2019. I'll be here tomorrow, and then I embark on a 3-week adventure away from the podcast. We'll be returning to the microphone on July 15th. I don't know how many of my listeners remember Bruce Cockburn, a Canadian artist who released a song in the 1980s called If I Had a Rocket Launcher. It was a pro-peace message behind a very militant metaphor. And in the early hours of the pre-dawn today, over somewhere near the Persian Gulf, an American drone was shot down out of the sky. And Iran made no effort to disguise its involvement. They acknowledged that they had shot it down, and they maintain that it had transgressed into Iranian airspace. 4:05 a.m. Iranian time, shot down by an Iranian surface-to-air missile system while operating, according to the U.S., in international airspace over the Strait of Hormuz. And it's being called by the United States an unprovoked attack on a U.S. surveillance asset in international airspace. And my first reaction to this is to think of the way Israel has intercepted the Gaza Freedom Flotilla boats year after year in international waters, subjected them to often violent takedowns. And so the respect for international waters, international airspace, is often a very flexible matter. So Trump loves this moment. He gets to talk tough. And this man who is so insecure overcompensates on a regular basis. Talking to reporters today, he said Iran made a very big mistake, and that the claim of the drone being over international waters has been, in Trump's unusual term, scientifically documented. Now, this is the guy who doesn't believe science on, say, abortion, when does life begin, certainly doesn't accept science when it comes to climate change, but here, he's all down with it. And we see Democrats kind of caught in the middle. Nancy Pelosi says, well, let's make sure we don't have a beating of the drum for something without the clarity of fact involved. And then, recognizing that that was a convoluted statement, she said, let's get the facts as to how we got to this place. All right, fair enough. And so we have a situation here that is escalating on an almost daily basis. And this is the design of John Bolton, the warmonger who Trump installed as his national security advisor. After cooler heads, H.R. McMaster left because he was unwilling to do this kind of dirty work for Trump. He also didn't have the long-term deep bias against Iran that John Bolton has freely exposed for years now. So this RQ-4A drone was shot down. We're told it flies at 40,000 feet. It's designed to fly that high to avoid surface-to-air missiles. But, as I reported earlier this week, an American drone was shot down by less equipped Houthi fighters in Yemen. And that was recently, and it is, I believe, the 4th incident of that type this year. And American taxpayers are losing $130 million every time one of these big high-tech surveillance machines is shot out of the sky. And, as well, Saudi Arabia and the Houthis said that the Houthis fired a cruise missile into Saudi Arabia last night. So pressure is building, and we're going to see what happens next here. In the United States Senate today, with 7 Republicans joining most Democrats, they voted to block the sale of billions of dollars of munitions to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Now, the Trump administration has claimed that there's this emergency They said it was an emergency before things escalated with Iran, but now it's convenient to say, well, look, Iran, we've got to rearm the Saudis. And so, critically, this is not a veto-proof margin. But to see 7 Democrats say that we will not fuel the Saudis with more munitions at this time, that is significant. Now, the biggest weasel in the group is Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, who once was, during the 2016 campaign, was very free in his speech that just lambasted Trump. And now he kisses the golden-haired ass whenever he has the opportunity. So, despite voting against this, knowing that it'll be vetoed and they don't have the votes to override it, Lindsey Graham is all on board, backing Trump for potential military action against Iran. He was excited to be going to the White House this afternoon so he could sit down with Trump and talk about this glorious act of liberation that we appear to be bent on taking. And what's at stake here in this deal? $8 billion worth of munitions and the plan to allow Raytheon to build a munitions plant in Saudi Arabia. Any coincidence that the new acting Secretary of Defense used to be an executive and lobbyist for Raytheon? Over at the New York Times, Max Fisher, who writes analytical pieces, does a pretty good job of stitching together comments from experts to build a very persuasive case that Iran has had all of its potential avenues of response to the U.S. abrogation of the nuclear agreement and the sanctions that have been in effect now for almost a year. We have closed every peaceful route that Iran could take. And while I do accept that Iran shot down the drone, I am still quite skeptical that Iran was responsible for those silly attempted attacks on the twin tankers in the Gulf of Oman just a week ago today. So Fisher writes, they, referring to nonpartisan experts, say that Iran appears to be pursuing a provocative but calibrated strategy to counter what its leaders see as potentially existential American threat, as severe sanctions strangle the economy and threaten to end the nuclear agreement. He says Iran is falling back on tactics associated with its reputation as a rogue state, including asymmetric military escalation, like threatening oil shipments, though Iran denies the American accusations that it attacked the tankers. And he quotes Harvard University expert Dina Esfandiri. Iran lashing out is a way for it to show the rest of the world, look, we've been acting in a relatively restrained manner in the years since Trump pulled out of the agreement, but now we can't. And so Iran is, in many ways, pressing the point by publicly announcing that it has enriched more uranium than the agreement permits. And Fisher continues here, as the costs of keeping the nuclear agreement in place rose, Iran came to bear all of its obligations with ever fewer of its upsides, along with its overwhelming economic and military pressure from the U.S. He goes on, the threat puts credibility to Iran's argument that it cannot be expected to deliver its half of the deal unreciprocated in perpetuity. That's related to the nuclear enrichment changes. And it appears calculated, he says, to create a crisis just large enough to pressure European and Asian powers to step in and rein in the United States, but small enough to be easily defused. Now, of course, these carefully calibrated efforts can quickly spin out of control if there is a misstep, if there is arrogance, a misreading of signals. And so Max Fisher quotes Brett McGurk, who was until recently the Trump administration's envoy to the coalition fighting the Islamic State. He said ever-increasing sanctions and other American pressures on Iran offer no plausible on-ramp for Iran to enter negotiations, and if carried to their logical conclusion, point to regime change. And Fisher concludes, in short, experts said the United States, by its strategy and sheer power, has closed off virtually all peaceful avenues for Iran to respond. So, Iran's in a corner. The superpower with nuclear weapons, an armada of drones, and a fleet of fighter jets is leaning on Iran. And I heard Rush Limbaugh this morning spouting that same cocky bullshit that we heard from the neocons before the invasion of Iraq. Iran, it'll be a cakewalk. We can use limited strikes, and there's nothing they can do to retaliate. And Rush boy, have you ever heard of Hezbollah? That could change the equation in, overnight. I want to recommend a piece published at Mint Press News today under the byline of Dr. Nafeez Ahmed. He is a British-based journalist who I have a high regard for. And he goes through the so-called evidence of the limpet mines found on one of the two ships in the Gulf of Oman that were hit last week. And he cites Dr. Gwynne Dyer, who is a, Reserve Naval Officer, Royal Canadian Naval Reserve, U.S. Naval Reserve, British Royal Navy Reserve. Boy, I didn't know you could you could do a trifecta. Anyway, despite believing on balance that Iran is probably behind the series of Gulf oil tanker attacks, he says the evidence is far from conclusive. Then Ahmed cites Stratfor, which is CIA Light. They run an intelligence service for corporate America. I used to get free copies of their daily blasts. And they say that the recent attacks, that while Iran would have reason to harass vessels around its territory, it doesn't make strategic sense for Iran to target European vessels at a time when it's desperately seeking to retain the continent's political and economic support. Stratfor suggests that other culprits might be al-Qaeda, other regional jihadi outfits that have a similar MO to target oil tankers. He also, Dr. Dyer, observed that as limpet mines cling to ships' hulls by magnetic force but have to be placed by hand, it means they were probably placed while the ships were in port. And get this, the two ships that were attacked last week, their last port of call was in Saudi Arabia. All 6 tankers that have been attacked sailed from ports in Saudi or the UAE. This suggests the mines would have been planted on the tankers before departure, because once the ship is underway, it's almost impossible for divers or swimmers or even small boats to get alongside without being noticed. So Ahmed then says, well, who are the other likely state culprits? The leading candidates, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. Don't forget the good old US of A, friends. And don't forget Israel. Those are my additional comments. So the Japanese government still saying that the U.S. explanation doesn't make sense? Quote, these are not definite proof that it's Iran. Even if it's the United States that makes the assertion, we cannot simply say we believe it. Even? Even if? So also, Ahmed notes that the original claims that was passed along to John Bolton, such a neutral party, came from the Mossad at a meeting in the White House in April. And so when you look dispassionately and objectively at the facts and the so-called evidence that has been presented, well, it's not persuasive at all. And will the media really remain skeptical? We've seen moments. I've praised Rachel Maddow for her recent skepticism about the assertions by Trump and the intelligence agencies that Iran is responsible. I don't believe that that will hold. And I've linked to Nick Kristoff's column in the New York Times today. He notes that he served as a reporter in Iran, and he kind of trots out his anti-Ayatollah bona fides. He also was detained in Iran and I understand that part of his experience. He notes that Iran has responded to Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear agreement. First, Iran warned it would violate the terms of the deal. Alarmed and flailing about, Washington this week had the gall to call on Iran to adhere to the pact that Trump has savaged. Yeah, it's true. And we see the media talk about how Iran is now in violation of the agreement without bothering to mention that we got there first. And second, he says, Christoph, Iran was probably behind the attacks. It's not impossible that Iran is being framed, but even knowledgeable Democrats believe the Trump administration is correct about Iran's responsibility. And there, as you know, I think he is he's accepting things from sources that have burned him in the past. And Christoph should know better. Meanwhile, the U.S. House yesterday, supported by the resistance Democrats, defeated an attempt to put some reasonable limits on Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that would provide greater protections for Americans who get caught up in phone surveillance and other wiretaps, other ways that the government is monitoring communications. It's a little complicated, but Americans often end up being pulled into the pools of collection inadvertently because they were mentioned in a call between two foreigners, one who was not in the United States, or at least one of them. And this is a disgusting moment because 126 Democrats joined with 127 Republicans to maintain the status quo and to give Trump this clear and present threat, right, to our constitutional rights, the ability to continue to violate them at will. And this points up how the Democrats are not there to protect you and me. They have an agenda that's different from Trump. But it's not my agenda or your agenda. So Mark Morgan, the knuckle dragger who Trump has reinstalled at ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, he echoed Trump's threats that were tweeted earlier this week that ICE is going to begin an operation to target and remove so-called undocumented immigrant families who have received final orders of removal. And what's really off base about this, beyond it being cruel and pandering to Republican base voters, they believe that this is going to be a deterrent. Mark Morgan, quote, "It's going to send a strong message to those individuals contemplating coming here illegally not to do so. We're going to send a powerful message to individuals in the Northern Triangle countries. Do not come, do not risk it." Well, dude, the people in those countries know what's going on. They fear that a border wall or some other big screen is going to be set up there. And they're taking their chances to try to beat the clock. And they are driven by poverty, by violence, and by conditions that have been created by the United States in its support of repressive governments in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Honduras. And they will not be deterred. I don't believe they will. And you can serve up, a million examples. But if I'm sitting in a village in Guatemala where drought has killed the crops again this year, and I'm looking at desperately trying to feed my kids, do you think I'm going to be deterred by Mark Meadows' threats? I've been covering this week the comments of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the New York Congresswoman, who has drawn a lot of criticism for calling America's migrant detention facilities concentration camps. And as I've told you, it was Jonathan Katz, in an op-ed in the LA Times over a week ago, who introduced this idea. So I want to commend a writer at Esquire, that's a website and a magazine I rarely look at, but Jack Holmes wrote a piece where he cited the experts. Andrea Pitzer, who wrote the book One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. said, "We have what I would call a concentration camp system, and the definition of that in my book is mass detention of civilians without trial." Then Holmes cites Waitman Wade Bjorn, a Holocaust and Genocide Studies historian at the University of Virginia. Things can be concentration camps without being Dachau or Auschwitz. Concentration camps in general have always been designed at the most basic level to separate one group of people from another, usually because the majority group or the creators of the camp deem the people they're putting in it to be dangerous or undesirable in some way. And Holmes recaps the American adventure with concentration camps during World War II when we locked up the Japanese Americans. And he goes through a litany here he didn't mention, but I will, that Bill Clinton set up a concentration camp at Guantanamo and sent Haitians there, fearing that they were riddled with the AIDS virus and would bring it to the United States. I don't believe those concerns were ever firmly proven. Next up in the stack here, another story from James Holmes at Esquire. And it is a report on Trump's foreign business holdings, which are described as a gobsmacking level of corruption. And I've linked to the story. I encourage you to read it. What I want to focus on is just the connections with Saudi Arabia. Now, Trump continues to hold more than $130 million in foreign assets in irrevocable trust. His business entanglements continue to leave him with assets, positions, trademarks, and other business interests in more than 30 countries. And we can never be sure, when he makes a decision, whether it is to further his business interests or American foreign policy. Saudi foreign agents and lobbyists have spent more than $270,000 to put up a group of veterans at the Trump International Hotel. A last-minute visit by the Saudi Crown Prince drove Trump International Hotel in Manhattan's room revenue up 13% in the first 3 months of 2018, following a 2-year decline. The Trump Hotel Chicago, there's an internal report there breaking down by country of origin the people who visit. And the Washington Post got documents that showed a 169% increase in Saudi Arabia-based patrons since 2016. This is obvious, glaring conflict of interest. It is rampant, brazen corruption. They should impeach this guy, and the Democrats are still dithering. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And I'm grateful for all the people who've checked in from around the world to observe the 10th anniversary of the podcast. Today, I want to name Steve Wazensky, Judy Holloway, Terry Paris, and Patrick Garay. They are staunch supporters of this podcast with subscriptions, and I invite you to do the same. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, click on the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber, and when you land on the sign-up page, you can choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. As always, if you're allergic to PayPal, hit me in the U.S. mail at Box 150 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, over to the NRA, the National Rifle Association. There's a bit of a firing squad going on. They have put on leave, and not quite fired, the number 2 executive, Chris Cox. And I don't believe he's the former congressman from Orange County. He's been at the NRA for a while, and apparently he sided with Oliver North during the attempted coup against the strong-arm leader of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre. And that occurred a couple of months ago, and it's finally catching up with Cox, who was placed on administrative leave. He said, "The allegations against me are offensive, patently false. For 24 years, I've been a loyal, effective leader in this organization," and blah, blah, blah. But the latest president, the one who took over after Ollie North was bounced, Carolyn Meadows, "I fully support the actions undertaken today. The NRA is moving forward on all fronts, especially with regard to serving our members," and blah, blah, blah. And hey, when heavily armed advocates for the Second Amendment are squabbling, the best idea is to get out of the way. I'm really troubled by this ruling from the once uber-liberal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals here in San Francisco. This came from a 3-judge panel, all appointed by Republicans. And they ruled that a Trump administration family planning gag rule that could cut as much as $60 million from Planned Parenthood could go into effect immediately. Now, this is pretextual. The gag rule is an attempt to prevent the part of Planned Parenthood, the 97% that is devoted to women's health care that doesn't include abortion. It's trying to prevent those people from responding to requests from patients and clients who want abortion information. The new rule will make clinics ineligible to receive funds if they provide abortions or referrals for them. This is just the latest effort to promote the extreme agenda of the far right wing. Only 20% of poll respondents in this country want to fully eliminate abortion. But the Trump administration is riding the political wave of anti-abortion activists in this country in a cynical and calculated way that will lead to the loss of life, botched abortions, many other impacts that we can predict based on our experience before Roe versus Wade became the law in this land. Justin Trudeau, who I occasionally slip and call by his father's name Pierre, is the Prime Minister of Canada, and he is enduring an uncomfortable visit with the Trumpster at the White House today. And I haven't really heard what they're blithering about, but critics have fired away. Number one, Canada is the lead organizer of the Lima Group. And the Lima Group is being used to present the facade of unity in trying to oust Nicolas Maduro as the leader of Venezuela. And this regime change group is evidenced by a recent job posting that was required under Canadian law. The Trudeau administration hired a guy named Alan Cullum as the special advisor on Venezuela, but they're required to post the details of the contract. And it shows that the job requirements are: use your network of contacts to advocate for expanded support to pressure the illegitimate government to return constitutional order. Use your network in Venezuela to advance priority issues as identified by civil society and the Government of Canada. Must have valid Government of Canada personnel, top secret security clearance. The other hypocritical move by Trudeau occurred this week. One day after the Parliament in Canada passed a motion declaring a climate emergency, the Trudeau cabinet has approved the expansion of a massive pipeline that will increase oil production in Alberta and release more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And in an admirable effort at doublespeak, Justin Trudeau said that he was elected with 2 promises: to grow the middle class and to fight climate change. We need to create wealth today so we can invest in the future. This project has the potential to create thousands of solid middle-class jobs for Canadians. Won't do you any good once the planet is cooked and human extinction kicks in, Mr. Trudeau. And Trump's latest EPA director, who is named Andrew Wheeler. He is the former coal industry lobbyist. He issued new rules yesterday that kill the Obama-era climate rules that were attempting to regulate coal-fired power plants and essentially regulate them into shutting down. And it's fair to say that courts killed Obama's effort. But the new rules will simply allow the states to determine which coal-fired power plants will continue to operate. And Kevin Gostola has a good piece over at Shadowproof today, noting that a new report shows that the EPA is failing to protect the environment from hazardous waste from oil and gas drilling, citing a report from Earthworks updating a 2015 study. There are 1.3 million oil and gas facilities in the United States, and they are often spewing toxic outputs. The U.S. leads the world in producing toxic oil and gas waste. Hey, we're number one. Meanwhile, the class war that climate change will provoke, the outlines of it are starting to show. A New York Times story today notes that with sea level rise, communities will have to decide whether to build seawalls or just move uphill. And this is going to cause communities of color and poverty communities to be written off, where the communities of those with money will get seawalls and reinforcement and other efforts to preserve life as long as possible. The Joe Biden gaffe machine kicked in again yesterday, and this is just another example of why I could never support this man for president. He says stupid things, and then he doubles down on them. So he keeps talking about how in the old days when he first got to the Senate, these ultra-segregationists from the South were people that he could work with in a civil manner. And he's so tone-deaf, he doesn't understand how bad that sounds in 2019. And I just want to underscore that criticism of Joe Biden is not an attack. Unless you want to criticize him in some deeply personal or, libelous way, talking about his political history, talking about the stupidity of his comments, that's not an attack. That's honest evaluation of a prospect for President of the United States. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast today. You're free to share it far and wide with absolutely everyone. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.